Today, injustice for sterling is injustice for all. Hello again, it's Martin North from Digital Finance Analytics. Welcome to this post covering finance and property news with a distinctively Australian flavour. Today I'm joined by Robbie Barwick from the Citizens Party. Hi Robbie.
Hi Martin.
How you going?
Yeah, good. It's one of those days though where it's the first day of the last sitting week of the federal parliament before the election, and it's battle stations. This is a call to arms. We want people to hit the phones because we might be able to make a big difference this week on an important campaign that is not just about the particular case of the financial institution that collapsed, but is emblematic of what's wrong with ASIC and why our system of financial regulation must be cleaned up.
Yeah, the point is that anybody who has any investments at all need to take notice and understand that there are significant risks in the system that the regulator avoids, and that the risks come back onto individual investors and you can lose a lot of money. So it's important to make a fuss.
If you're not a financial victim yet, you easily could be. And when you do, you will find yourself spending thousands of hours learning about things like ASIC, AFCA, the Banking Code of Conduct, the compensation scheme of last resort. You'll become an expert in it, and no politician's going to want to listen to you. And you'll be one of hundreds of thousands around Australia who know these subjects really well because they've been burnt so badly by them. And so you need to be aware of that and take note that, okay, if you're not a victim yet, that is the state of play of financial regulation in Australia. Join the fight to clean it up, because injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere, and this is a particularly egregious case.
And Robbie, just before we go into the specifics, it's worth, I think, highlighting again, this is a deliberate set of structures that have been put in place by the government to make it really, really hard to get anything done, right? This is not just, bad by accident. This is bad by design.
Exactly. It's intentional. They have an ideology which they call buyer beware, aka caveat emptor, is the Latin phrase. And they tell you that's the philosophy by which regulation of the financial system operates in Australia. But Martin, no other sector of Australia is regulated in the same way.
Yep.
When you go to buy food from a shop that's in a container, you don't take it home and get out your Bunsen burner and your pH detectors and see if it's poisonous or not and whether you can consume it, because there's a system of regulation which means that food must be able to be consumed by human beings, right? It's not buyer beware, it is seller beware. And that applies everywhere in Australia. I mean, we have a very highly regulated society across the board. Go for a trip to Europe or America or whatever, and then come back and compare it, even down to the speed limit you can drive on the roads. Everything is highly regulated in Australia, and therefore it's entirely legitimate that the average Aussie assumes that when they're making the biggest decision of their lives, usually, which is where they put their retirement investments, that the system that regulates that is the same. And it is not. There is effectively no regulation. It's fake regulation, and it is just consuming people by the hundreds of thousands.
And of course, the superannuation, of course, is a mandated government scheme. Yes. So you have no choice, right? This is a tune you have to dance, right? But You're dancing this tune against a regulatory backcloth that actually is designed not to protect you, but to protect the large financial institutions, the people who are making a mozza out of this system. And so this is a conversation about what we need to do about that. And sterling is a really good instance of the problem we've got. But as I say, anybody who's got investments, anybody who's got superannuation, this concerns you.
So exactly. So Martin, sterling is a case that the Citizens Party got involved in last year. So it's the collapse of the Sterling First Rent for Life scheme where most of the victims are around the city of Mandurah in Western Australia, but there's some in other parts of Australia as well. We were introduced to it by the great Denise Braley, and I call her the great Denise Braley because Denise has been fighting against financial corruption and on behalf of victims for no reward for decades and decades. Recently, I had the pleasure of watching an Australian Story episode from the year 2000 about Denise and when her campaign in what was called the finance brokers scandal in Western Australia brought down the WA Liberal government in the next election. And it was quite extraordinary. She's been compared to Erin Brockovich. And I think the title of that Australian Story episode in the year 2000 was Saviour on a Shoestring. Now, just on that, Denise has agreed to be the Citizens Party's lead Senate candidate for the upcoming federal election in Western Australia, lead Senate candidate for Western Australia for the upcoming federal election. The Citizens Party, because we want people to understand our policy approach to campaigning, not personalities, but policy, every fortnight we've been doing a live stream where Australians can participate and ask questions about our policies. And the one coming up this week on Thursday night, 7:30 Eastern Daylight Time, so Melbourne, Sydney, etc., is called Cleaning Out Financial Corruption. And I'll be on it. Denise Braley will be on it. Craig Ishwood, the founder of the party, will be on it. Our lead Senate candidate for New South Wales, Kingsley Liu, will be on it, and a few others. And we're going to talk about how we approach this in a policy way to deal with financial corruption. So please tune in, and you can submit questions beforehand by email at ask@citizensparty.org.au. If you want to ask us about our approach and the broader issues here that we'll be tackling with the benefit of the experience of someone like Denise who's been fighting this. But anyway, so there's the plug. So please tune in on Thursday night, 7:30 if you can. Denise, though, like I said, introduced us to the Sterling First case. And as it goes, Sterling is a relatively small financial collapse. The total amount of money lost was $18 million. And that loss has been shared among something like, when you count couples, 100 to 130 elderly people have shared that loss. Now, that is tiny relative compared to many other managed investment scheme collapses around Australia. However, this one became the subject of a Senate inquiry last year, thanks to our party, thanks to your channel and your viewers participating. And that's why we're doing this today, because we need people to saddle up again. When the viewers of DFA and the Citizens Party, etc., pick up the phone and make those calls to Canberra at the opportune time, they can be very effective. And that's what we need to do this week. There's a 3-day sitting of Parliament, and it's the last sitting before the federal budget. And in fact, you couldn't rule out that once Frydenberg hands down the budget on Tuesday night, because today's Monday, tomorrow night, and then Anthony Albanese does his budget reply on Thursday, you couldn't rule out Morrison going straight to the Governor-General on Friday and calling the election, because frankly, I don't think it can get any worse for you. So this time is of the essence here. And what we want to do is force this issue into the election campaign, this question of Sterling First, right? So what we're calling for is phone calls to 5 members of Parliament to demand they compensate these Sterling victims. And the 5 members of Parliament are Morrison, Finance Minister Simon Birmingham, Anthony Albanese, Shadow Finance Minister Katie Gallagher, and Shadow Minister for Financial Services, Stephen Jones. Now, those are all strategic targets. And the reason why is because you want the leaders of the party to have to account. The Shadow Minister for Financial Services, Stephen Jones, is actually the person in the Parliament with a rank in the parties who's most aware of the Sterling situation. And the Finance Minister and the Shadow Finance Minister are crucial because they have the power to make what's called an act of grace payment. And they could write out a check, literally, to pay these sterling victims, right? Without, they don't even have to admit liability, but they could do that and actually settle this case quite easily. This mechanism exists. This is the way they need to be compensated. But let's go through why. Why these victims, right? What's so important about sterling first? This is the case why everyone in Australia should get behind it. This is the case that could be the catalyst to bring down the whole regulatory system, because it so glaringly exposes the failings of the system, right? This case does. There's hundreds of thousands of victims out there. They all deserve compensation. And we're in principle, we're behind them all. But this case has got attention for a lot of very important reasons. First, the victims are elderly, frail, and vulnerable. And the way, as things stand right now, they're all going to be evicted from their homes and made homeless. And they don't have any ability to start again, Martin. We're going to force a whole bunch of people out in the street. And so the question is, well, do they deserve to be? No, because they were taken down by a very complex managed investment scheme, but they didn't know they were in it. They didn't know they were in it, but ASIC knew they were in it. ASIC knew what they were exposed to. They didn't know. And I want to point out, this came out of the hearing. There was something quite extraordinary, because the ASIC chairman, Joe Longo, Alan Bond's former lawyer, the guy who rubbed shoulders with some of the biggest financial crooks in the world and has represented them and has now been brought in as Dracula in charge of the blood bank to run the regulator. One of his excuses for ASIC's appalling failings in this case was he said, well, the victims didn't complain about ASIC when they were in the scheme. And there's a reason for that, though. They didn't know they were in a scheme. All they knew was that they had prepaid their rent for the rest of their life. That's all they knew. They didn't know they were investors. They would never have become investors. They just prepaid their rent for the rest of their life. But ASIC knew. And ASIC knew the people running the scheme had a history of being crooks. And ASIC knew that it had received repeated complaints about the scheme, which it repeatedly marked no further action. ASIC knew that the product disclosure statement, such as it was, even though the victims didn't see it, was dodgy anyway. ASIC knew all that, yet it did not take action against this scheme, right? And consequently, by the time after even the state government of Western Australia eventually complained to ASIC, and even then it took months for ASIC to start even looking at it. By the time it all came crashing down in 2019, whereas if ASIC had first acted in 2015 when they were informed, when people did make complaints, people in ASIC made complaints about the scheme to their superiors. If ASIC had have acted then, maybe a couple of people would have lost a couple of 100,000, and that money could have easily been taken from the company and paid back to them. By the time ASIC did act in 2019, 130 people lost $18 million and the company was defunct, and there's no money to pay anyone back, right? And that's why this is ASIC's failings. And if it's ASIC's failings, it's the government's failings, because ASIC operates under the philosophy that the government sets for it, right? And that's what we need people to understand. I've made some points here for people to tell members of parliament if they get into discussion. First, full compensation is absolutely necessary for the survival of the victims and for justice, right? Justice, something like this cannot happen without there being justice. And unfortunately, in the financial sector, the victims are usually denied justice in Australia, and that's atrocious. That's appalling. Second, the victims didn't know what they were exposed to, but ASIC did and didn't act. That's the problem. Third, ASIC is a weak and ineffective regulator because of the government's philosophy of buyer beware. So therefore, ASIC's failures are the government's failures, and it's the government that's responsible for compensating them. Fourth, there's a thing that the politicians are probably going to tell people, which is there's a plan to create what's called a compensation scheme of last resort, and that's supposed to cover all the people who can't get compensation in other ways. Well, first of all, it's not passed yet. Second, the government's version of the scheme is pathetic. It excludes most types of financial victims. Third, Labor has said they'll expand it, and Choice consumer organisation is behind that campaign, and we are as well. It should be expanded for sure. However, even if you expand it, the decisions that it takes are adjudicated by another agency called AFCA, the Australian Financial Complaints Authority. And that too is rigged in favour of the perpetrators and against the victims. That's a whole nother story. So you can expand the compensation scheme of last resort to cover absolutely everybody in principle, and take away the cap entirely on amount of compensation so people can get $100 billion in compensation if necessary. But AFCA, who makes these decisions, always makes decisions in favour of the perpetrators and not the victims, right? So unless that's cleaned up as well, that's not going to do anything for these victims, and these victims need compensation immediately. And so the fifth point is the government has this mechanism, an act of grace payment that it can make. That's why you would single out this group and say, okay, we cannot have 100 plus elderly people made homeless on the streets, ruined in the final years of their life. 20 of them have already died, by the way, Martin, and a whole bunch of them have terminal illnesses, etc., and are about to die. You cannot have that. If we have any self-respect as Australians, we cannot tolerate that. And so they must be compensated immediately, and the same impulse then must be used to clean out ASIC. That's what we're calling on the Australian public to get behind this case. Let's use this case as the catalyst to demand a total overhaul of ASIC. And what we want people to do when you make the call, go hard on these members of parliament. You're going to probably talk to most of their aides and they'll have to pass on messages. But for the Labor Party, the specific thing we're asking them to do is commit to this as an election pledge. Because if they are going to be the next government in a few months' time, it will be so important to have applied the blowtorch on this subject to them so they come into office painfully aware that they cannot shirk this. Labor knows the government has tried to, rewrite history and whitewash the Banking Royal Commission out of existence. Labor knows that. But what are they going to do about it? Because unfortunately, they have their own cosy relationship to the big end of town through things like the superannuation funds, etc. Right? And are they going to just be a pale imitation of the Liberals? Right? Are they going to come up with a scheme to give these elderly people busking rights in the streets of Mandurah in their homelessness so they can at least eat? Is that Labor's version of it? Or are Labor going to do the right thing and stare down the people, the big end of town, the financiers who want a weak and ineffective regulator and say, no, we draw a line here. We have to start compensating these victims and clean you out. That's what we need to force Labor to look at with this campaign.
Yeah, and it's worth just saying, Robbie, that ASIC's track record here is absolutely appalling, right? Of the many complaints they receive, almost none of those complaints are ever acted upon. And quite often what you discover is that they take forever to make a decision. They'll almost always find in favour of the big end of town. And in the meantime, the victims and those individuals basically get taken to the cleaners. So this is a really important case, and it's a microcosm of the broader issue that we have insubstantive regulation biased in favour of the financial system and against individual investors. And look, even people who have their investments in superannuation funds and other managed investment schemes, the question is, how do you know that what your scheme is doing is actually right and appropriate and delivering you what you think it's delivering, right? Because often it is really tough to find out. And very often ASIC knows something, yet chooses not to act.
Yes. And, this whole system could be easily dealt with or partly dealt with. You need to tweak a lot of things. But before ASIC adopted this caveat emptor philosophy, and also the other way they express it is the efficient markets theory. And actually, they're quite explicit about that, Martin. Our regulatory philosophy is based on the efficient markets theory, which basically says the markets can't be wrong, right? The relevant knowledge is all there, and of course, it's just not true for unsophisticated investors, and most people are unsophisticated. But thanks to our superannuation scheme, they're expected to be investors. right? So before that, though, ASIC used to actually rate financial products. They would say, look, we think this one's safe and we think this one's not. And that would help immensely if they did that. But of course, they're responsible, therefore, for the ratings, right? And that's fine. And maybe they won't always get it right. But I tell you what, the one or two stuff-ups before the end of the 90s where ASIC got it wrong pales into insignificance compared to the $40 billion in losses that 200,000 Australians have suffered in managed investment schemes since 2008. Just the crashes since the collapses since 2008 add up to $40 billion and 200,000 victims. And that's not all of them, right? That's not the people, who have been done over by dud mortgages, for instance. That's a whole another area of financial victims, right, that have been failed by the system. So this is a systemic problem in Australia, and we need to force the point. But I think what I'm appealing to Australians to think about, when you weigh up everything else, can we not agree that you cannot be a victim in this way and then just be ignored and flushed down the toilet? There must be justice, right? And justice, we're a country that doesn't even send bankers to jail, for crying out loud. So there's very seldom any justice there. There must be justice for the victims, and not through window dressing like this compensation scheme of last resort. Let's make them, we know these mechanisms exist. Let's make them get serious. So I'll provide the, Martin, for the sake of the viewers, we'll put the numbers below for these, the Canberra phone numbers for these 5 politicians. Please just, as soon as you finish this, take 10 minutes, call them all. Tell them, especially if you're not from Manchester, especially if you're not a victim yourself, tell them that you're not a victim. You're calling on behalf of the victims. This is outrageous, because this is about a system that serves all of us, and you're demanding they commit to this very basic thing. And if it's the Labor people, demand they make it an election pledge. And we'll keep building on this over the next few weeks as the election unfolds.
Yeah, thanks, Robbie. We'll put the details below. We'll also put the link to your event on Thursday. I encourage people to go take a look at that. This is a really important issue. There's $3 billion sitting in investments across Australia at the moment, and some of that is in places that if you knew about it, you wouldn't want to invest there. So this is a really important, big-scale issue. But the pointy end, the sterling first end, is how to unpick it. So make those calls. Thanks, Robbie.
Thanks, Martin.